Councilwoman Sedebaca.
Thank you. I think CPD would answer this, or maybe City Attorney, but I want to ask about the protest petition. Anyone left?
Yep, Nate Lucero's coming up.
While you're coming up, I'll ask the question. So I saw the correspondence from CPD, specifically with Libby Adams. The petitioners, back in October, they had gotten the instructions about how to conduct the protest petition. They sent back a long list of questions asking for clarity. Libby responded to that long list of questions. The particular question that they had asked was about who is authorized to sign on behalf of a property owner and what documents are acceptable. And Libby Adams listed, I think, 4 or 5 different instruments. The applicants chose a couple of those to use in gathering petitions, and then their petitions were deemed invalid, all of a sudden bringing in some new citation about required documents. Can you tell me a little bit about the protest petition and why the signatures were rejected even though they were in compliance with what they were told by Libby was acceptable?
Sure. Nathan Lucero, Assistant City Attorney. Good evening, members of council. Councilwoman Sedebaca, thank you for the question. So the list of documents that Libby provided to the protest petitioners is also contained in the protest petition guide. And those are samples of documents that may be submitted to show proof of ownership. And in reviewing the protest petition signatures and the documentation that was submitted, it was determined that the statements of authority, the resolutions and statements of authority that were submitted were not sufficient to show that these folks that were signing the protest petition were not sufficient to show that they were proof of ownership, and that these folks that were signing the petition had the authority from various entities to sign on behalf of those entities. So in other words, there were certain situations where the protest petitioners provided sufficient documentation. For example, the property may have changed hands, and the names of ownership were different from what the assessor's record had. The protest petitioners provided documentation showing that these individuals that were signing the protest petition were actually the owners of these properties. But when it came to some of these statements of authority, there was no reference to any governance document that might lead the city to believe that, okay, this individual has authority on behalf of this entity to sign on behalf of the organization. Not only was there no reference to any governance document that would lead us to believe that, they didn't supply any governance document that would validate the person signing off on these purported statements of authority.
But were the documents that they did submit any of the listed instruments in the email from Libby?
They were listed, but the point is they can't just supply a document and say, this is what we say it is because we say it is. It has to be authenticated some way with either additional documentation to say, yes, this person has the authority on behalf of our entity to sign documents for us, or they have to, within the document itself, somehow allude to their governance documents that provide the authority for this individual to sign. So that way, the city can do its due diligence and research that document to see whether or not the person offering themselves as the person with authority actually has that authority. And so proof is something that's a burden for the protest petitioners. They have to, they're required to submit the protest petition 7 days before the public hearing, and it has to be complete. CPD has to have everything they need in order to judge this petition, because that's going to require a vote of at least 10 council members in the affirmative on the requested rezoning. And so that creates a pretty high bar, and I think if the city were not doing its due diligence to make sure that the protest petitioners were authorized to sign the protest petition, then we would be doing a disservice to the community and to this council.
Agreed. I've scoured the guidance, and the guidance doesn't actually suggest that they need to submit multiple documentation, multiple instruments proving that they are the person authorized to sign on behalf of the owner. Where do we indicate that they have to submit multiple instruments? And what is our protocol for due diligence? What do we verify? How do we do it? And who does it?
So CPD reviews those protest petitions, and if they have legal questions as to the authority of certain individuals to sign, they could consult with the city attorney's office. In this case, they did so. And I'm sorry if I...
Can you be more specific on the process? So for example, the Fair Elections Fund, the clerk and recorder has to verify that a donor is indeed a Denver resident. They check first, I think, the voter database. If they're not a voter, then they check multiple other databases, and they have it listed what their process is for verification. What is CPD's process for verification?
So their protest petition guide offers what their process is. Because
it actually doesn't.
The process isn't laid out. It does. The process isn't laid out in the charter, and the process isn't necessarily laid out in the Denver zoning code. So CPD has developed a protest petition guide. And the guide does offer the same documents that Libby listed when she was asked by the protest petitioners what would be the appropriate documentation. So those are examples of documents that can be supplied. But as I explained earlier, the statements of authority that were submitted in this instance were not sufficient.
So it sounds like you don't know our process.
What do you mean?
What is our process of verification? Where do we look? What data systems do we look in to verify who an owner is and if an instrument is sufficient?
But Nate, before you answer that, I'm just going to just interject here. This was related to the rezoning question, and we're past the rezoning. So I'm not going to limit your questions, but I just want to say that this doesn't relate to the ballot question that we're still in hearing for.
In my opinion, it does, because we're advancing something to the ballot that is actively being appealed that would have not been possible based on the vote tonight. So the rezoning vote, if it would have passed, if their signatures would have been valid, a supermajority would have been needed to pass the rezoning, which did not exist. So the rezoning would not have happened tonight. Therefore, we wouldn't be advancing a valid question.
And I think we would be still. Let me just ask this question of Nate. What is the time period for submitting an appeal?
What
on the
was
protest
question?
petition?
The city has not received an appeal that I'm aware of.
But is there a time limit for providing one?
I guess my question would be, does council know who the appeal would be to?
No.
We've been told
Because
that it is the Board of
the-
Adjustments, and in the charter, it does suggest that the Board of Adjustments would be where an appeal process happens. I was also told that it would be 16 or 17 days by Anshul Baga for them to submit their request. However, If they have not submitted it and I've seen documentation of them requesting an appeal, what is the process for them to?
Either way, it's a process independent of our decision-making.
So then the question is, what happens if it goes through an appeal process and it is overturned and we do have to revote, or there is no rezoning?
Councilwoman Cedevach, I don't think I could speculate as to what may occur.
So what happens advancing a ballot question without the zoning it needs to be implemented?
Again, I think you're asking me to speculate on what would have happened had the protest petition been valid.
No, I'm asking you, given there's an active appeal, what will happen if the decision is overturned?
And I think Nate is saying no appeal has been submitted. Am I reading that wrong?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Has an appeal been received by anyone in community planning and development?
Well, I don't know. CPD, like I said, the protest petition process in the Denver zoning code doesn't specify what the appeal process would be for that protest petition. Whether it was the protest petitioners challenging it or the rezoning applicant challenging the results of that protest petition. That section of the code doesn't speak to what happens if someone challenges it or where that appeal might go.
Thank you. That's it for my questions.
Great.